Good evening and welcome. My name is Adalgisa Giorgio and I am a retired member of the Italian section of the Department of Politics, Languages and International Studies at the University of Bath. I have been asked to introduce tonight's event, which is the first event of the new Italian Language and Culture Group at Bloomsbury. I can never pronounce this very well. The group is convened by academics in Italian studies at the University of Bath, and the actual events are organized by Professor Filia Allum and Enrico Cecconi. Filia could not be here with us tonight. Enrico is sitting there, and they also draw on me sometimes for advice. Actually, Filia and Enrico have the task of liaising with the institution and doing the practical work. We are very grateful to the institution for asking us to set up this group. They saw the potential of a permanent Italian group when they attended, a few members of the institution attended the mini film festival on mafia women in April 2024, which was actually a great success. We had a very good audience, very interested audiences, and that's how some of the members of the institution decided to invite us to form an Italian language and culture group. So we were very pleased to accept the invitation, and in fact, this group extends the links that our department has had for a while with Bloomsbury, because our department has provided a line of directors representing the university on the board of directors, and I have been one of these directors. I'm very proud of that. So the aims of the group are to take Italy and the research that members of the Italian group do at the university outside the campus and into the community of Bath. So we aim to create a connection between the city and university and the university's interests in Italy. We will try to hold events at regular intervals that focus on contemporary Italy and the different dimensions of Italian society and culture. And it is a great opportunity for the Italian team to showcase their excellence in teaching and research to the wider community in Bath. So we also want to thank the department, our Department of Policy, for supporting this particular event. So before I actually move on to pass the floor to Dr. Gala Ravelli, who is also a member of the Italian team at the university and who will actually introduce the speakers and will chair the session. I want to tell you there will be another event on the 3rd of April when the film Una Femmina will be shown as part of the 2025 Mafia Women Film Festival. And we're also planning an event for the 14th of May. So watch out for these events to come. And thank you for your interest. This evening, we are hosting a very special presentation and discussion on fascism in Italy with two great experts of fascism, Professor John Foote and Dr. Amy King, both our neighbors from the University of Bristol. And Dr. Gala Ravelli from the Italian team at the University of Bath will now introduce our distinguished guests, and will take us through the whole evening. So over to you, Gala. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adalgisa. Good evening, everyone. As Adalgisa mentioned, my name is Galadriel Ravelli. I'm a lecturer in Italian Studies, and I will be chairing the discussion tonight. So, as Adalgisa mentioned, we have two great speakers with us. Dr. Remy King is a senior lecturer in modern European history at the University of Bristol. Her book, which she has there, The Politics of Sacrifice, Remembering Italy's Rogo di Primavalle, considers the ways memory of a fatal arson attack on the home of a far-right militant in Rome in 1973 has been instrumentalized by neo-fascist groups over the past 50 years. And I think she's going to touch on that maybe later on. Professor John Foote is a professor of Italian history at the University of Bristol. He is the author of a number of books about Italian history and politics, and his book on the Red Brigades, an Italian left-wing terrorist group, will be out in June 2025, so just a few months. How this is going to work tonight, I'm going to now leave the floor to our speakers. They will speak for 15 minutes each, and then I will jump in and ask them to talk about some specific topics regarding fascism and its legacy. So this is probably going to last around an hour or so, and I will then open the floor to questions. So if you have a question, or if when you listen to our great speakers, you have something you want to ask, just hold it there, and I will pass the mic around at the end. Okay, thanks a lot.
Can I just say something about the housekeeping? It's not going to happen, but in case there is a fire, just remember to leave the room quickly. If there is something happening, we know that we have to go out.
Okay, don't jump out of the window.
Thank you, and thank you for the introductions, and for having us, in fact. Lovely to be described as distinguished, though I'm not sure it's quite true. I'm going to start by playing us a video for a couple of minutes, just 2 or so minutes.
Ci sono giovani che ancora credono nella politica, nella militanza, che si battono per le loro idee. Ragazzi di Gioventù Nazionale, alzatevi in piedi, siete stupendi.
Siamo l'anima.
Io sono fascista.
Siamo camerati, mica poveri coglioni. Ziccani.
Sono fiera di voi.
Quello a cui stiamo assistendo è un concerto di rock identitario, la musica che anima le serate dei militanti di estrema destra. In questo stesso luogo, oltre ai giovani che con le braccia tese inneggiano al duce, si incontrano anche gli esponenti dell'attuale destra di governo.
Sono preparati emotivamente per la serata di musica comunitaria.
I deputati di Fratelli d'Italia, Marco Perissa e Paolo Trancassini, si stringono l'avambraccio come dei veri camerati. Ed è sempre qui che proprio Nicola Procaccini, l'eurodeputato appena rieletto e uomo di fiducia di Giorgia Meloni, ringrazia i sostenitori con il saluto gladiatorio. Il posto in cui tutte queste cose succedono non è un covo di estrema destra, ma una sede di Fratelli d'Italia, e noi ci troviamo qui perché siamo parte dei suoi militanti.
Ziccani. Siamo proprio fascisti.
Con una nostra giornalista ci siamo infiltrati dentro Fratelli d'Italia, partendo dal cuore del partito. Gioventù Nazionale, il movimento giovanile, erede del Fronte della Gioventù e di Azione Giovani, dove è nata Giorgia Meloni.
Serena, piacere, sono laureata.
Ci sono giovani che ancora credono.
Don't need that again. All right, so in June 2024, Baxter, which is the investigative arm of this news platform called Fanpage, released its undercover investigation into the youth division of Giorgia Meloni's party, Brothers of Italy. And as you saw there in that footage, this investigation revealed kind of reverence of fascist culture, historic fascist culture, and it goes on to show kind of anti-Semitic language, racism, etc. It hit the press, it caused quite a stir in Italy in the summer, but it took Giorgia Meloni quite a long time to respond. And when she did finally respond, she did so by describing the journalists as using methods that regimes use. She did kind of finally distance herself from the racism and the anti-Semitism of the people exposed through this investigation. But crucially, for the things I think about in my work, she was reluctant to actually reject this kind of celebration of historic fascist culture. One of the focuses that this investigation took was on youth culture and the kind of separation between what the party and the kind of institutional representatives say about their ideology and what they are validating young people in doing. That wasn't very coherent, but you get what I mean. The kind of legitimization of youth culture that's much more extreme and much more kind of explicitly fascist. And that continues a trend that actually you saw in Italy in the 1970s, with a party that I'll introduce us all to in a minute, but a kind of party that were the heirs of the historic fascist regime and kind of resurrected fascism in the anti-fascist republic, whereby the actual institutional right said one thing, but the youth groups that they endorsed and they validated did something really quite different. I'm really interested in memory culture. That's the focus of my research and my book that Gala mentioned in the introduction. I'm fascinated by the kind of ambivalent relationship that Fratelli d'Italia and Giorgia Meloni and the other leaders have towards fascist culture, and the way that they allow commemoration to become explicitly fascist celebrations, spectacles, and moments of pageantry, despite declaring themselves as having drawn a line with their fascist heritage. So it's in the space of memory that I think we really see this ambivalent relationship between the party and the institutional far right and historic fascism. Rather than trying to condense my 90,000 word book into 10 minutes, I thought I would bring some of the themes that I'm interested in, the questions that I like to address to you through a kind of trip with me to Rome that I went on over the summer. So it's a slightly different case study, but the themes are pretty much identical. So let's go to Rome, but not a nice bit necessarily, at least not the historic centre. So last summer I visited the Tuscolano neighbourhood of Rome, which is kind of southeast of the historic centre, with a Canadian MA student who had also been interested in questions of neo-fascist memory culture. And we went for a stomp around this neighbourhood looking for signs of that memory culture kind of on the streets. We'd read about this street a lot. I'd kind of forgotten that Via Acca that you see down the middle was actually attached to a real place in a real city, because I'd just spent years reading about it. And we also knew that the thing that we were looking for, this Celtic cross, was so large that you can see it on Google Maps. But despite that, we actually struggled to find it. But you can see it in the top of the image here under that yellow arrow. The Celtic cross was a symbol that was adopted, kind of put forward, adopted and celebrated by neo-fascist youths in the 1970s who were trying to distance themselves from the actual formal far-right party, the MSI, the Movimento Sociale Italiano. And they wanted to distance themselves both kind of symbolically and through their iconography and suggest that they were a brand new kind of iteration of the far-right. So they rejected fascist iconography and took up that symbol as theirs. Possibly useful to introduce us to the MSI. This was a party that was founded in 1946, so after the official fall of fascism, was kind of the spiritual home for those people who mourned the loss of fascism and wanted to kind of resurrect that ideology. It was set up by a number of people who had held important and high-profile roles under the fascist regime. So there's some real continuation between fascism and the anti-fascist republic in that respect. And it was really ideologically divided. They wanted to kind of resurrect fascism and destroy communism, but there were kind of debates over the use of violence and whether or not violence could be kind of legitimately used as a political force to achieve that return of fascism. It lasted until in the mid-1990s, so it had a very long life, this party. And my work is on the 1970s. So this is a period in which political violence returns to the streets in Italy, as John's book In the Summer talks about. We have far left militants and far right militants kind of assassinating people, blowing each other up, bombs in piazzas, in banks, in trains. Death is very kind of present during this period. And the MSI really legitimizes young people who are engaged in this political violence. And although they declare themselves in some ways kind of distant from the actual acts of violence, the kind of radical violent culture that they create and celebrate and endorse kind of suggests that they were equally as complicit. So anyway, back to Rome. We were walking around this area looking for this particular spot. And as we walked, we entered from this Via delle Cave at the bottom of this long street. And you kind of walk through this archway that leads down to a car park and a supermarket. And kind of thinking, are we in the right place? This seems strange. And then we started to notice kind of black, white, and red stickers all over the bollards, suggesting kind of neo-Nazi colour schemes and symbols. Then you start to see slogans that kind of resurrect fascist slogans from the historic fascist period. And then you can't see it on this image, but right at the top, that piazza where the Celtic cross is surrounded by Italian flags. And on either side of this road are tall apartment buildings, residential buildings, kind of regular people living in these buildings that overlook this piazza. We finally found it and got to the end and found this. So you can see the Celtic cross in the top left image on the piazza and this doorway and the Italian flags all around. I'm going to take you back in time a bit and explain the relevance of this. So on the 7th of January 1978, so we're kind of in the thick of this period of political violence, a number of 5 young men who were part of the MSI's youth group headed out of this heavy black door into this piazza, and they were meant to be going to a nearby area to hand out leaflets. As they stepped outside, one of them was immediately gunned down by left-wing, far-left militants who were waiting just opposite the door with a machine gun. And one guy died immediately right there. The second victim died running up those stairs on the right, trying to escape. And then a third victim was kind of created later that day. The assailants vanished, but word got out that this political violence had kind of kicked off in Tuscolano, and police, locals, journalists, etc. kind of flooded to the scene, but so too did lots of other far left and far right-wing militants, and kind of clashes ensued. It's a bit shady on kind of actually what happened, but it's thought that a policeman fired his gun and in the confusion of that moment ended up killing a third of these far right militants right here. The MSI and the far right youth groups quickly flocked to the scene and kind of laid banners all around that piazza, claiming this as their own space. One MSI banner was kind of laid out over the pool of one of the victims' blood. Really kind of dark stuff happening here. And among the group that gathered were 2 of the most prominent terrorists who went on to commit a really terrible massacre in 1980 in Bologna. They actually ended up marrying each other, which is like a kind of crazy story. But anyway, this became the moment for many on the far right that they said prompted them to take up arms because the police had shot them. And historically, the police and the far right had kind of been supportive of one another. So it's a huge turning point, this case, and it's called the Acca Larenzia massacre. I was walking around here, again, went back in January, a couple of days after the annual commemoration. The deaths happened on the 7th of January, and I was there the day after. There were kind of leaflets everywhere. And as I was looking at this space, this older gentleman walked past me, all dressed in black, and whispered under his breath, onore, like honor to the victims, which was kind of an extraordinary moment. Anyway, each year on the 7th of January, not least this year, and these ceremonies have got much bigger under Meloni, neo-fascists gather at this spot. This year there were 1,400 of them, and they enact a ritual that originated under the fascist regime as part of the cult of the fascist martyrs. So under Mussolini, the names of the dead fascists would be read out by a leader standing at the front of the group, and you can see exactly the same thing happening here. The names of the dead would be read out, and the crowds would respond with the cry presente, so present, denoting the kind of eternal life of the fascist martyr after death. And as they would shout that, they would raise their right arms in the Roman salute, as the media calls it now with Elon Musk, the fascist salute. So this happens every year in this spot in Rome, and these have got larger under Meloni. And you can see the kind of black, white, and red flags as well. I'm going to pull out some of these posters. They do change every year, but the majority of them have some kind of recurring symbols. So this is from, what are we now, 2025? This is from 2024, a 7 denoting 7th of January. And actually, you often just see the number 7 graffitied on the wall in and around the area. Just the 7 is enough to kind of denote this tragedy for the neo-fascist supporters that gather there. You've also got a hand with a flame. I think what's really interesting is that to a passerby who doesn't know this story, this poster might not tell much. It doesn't give much away in terms of information on it. But to those who were there to partake in this ritual, it speaks to a really long-standing heritage. So the symbol here of the flame points to the existing heritage of these far-right youth groups. Fronte della Gioventù, which was the youth group of the MSI, where Meloni kind of cut her teeth and came of age, had this as their logo. Again, the fist holding aloft a tricolore flame. And the flame has been a recurring symbol for the far right in Italy, both under fascism, but particularly post-fascism. It's meant to kind of evoke this idea of the flame that never goes out at Mussolini's tomb and keeping the kind of fire of fascism alight in the anti-fascist republic. And in the mid-90s, when the MSI was kind of dissolved and reborn as National Alliance, the question of the party's logo really came back to the fore. There were lots of discussions about what to do with the historic MSI logo and whether it needed to be kind of removed in this symbolic dividing line between the past historic far-right party and this new party founded in the mid-90s. Anyway, changes were made to the logo and the size of this was reduced. So the point there being that the flame has kind of symbolic power for far-right groups and always has done. And so I think we need to ask questions about Meloni's tweet in 2022 when she declared this Fratelli d'Italia logo a symbol that we are proud of and return the flame kind of front and center. That to me and to everyone, I'm sure, who works on this stuff really points to this reclamation of a previously quite taboo iconography and heritage. So to kind of finish up this part on neo-fascist memory, Meloni talks about wanting to pacify, and that's her language, Italy's national memory culture. According to Meloni and the rest of her party, Italian national memory culture has gatekeepers that keep out far-right victims and only honour left-wing victims in the anti-fascist republic. And she argues that Italians should kind of incorporate the dead from across the political spectrum in order to unify the nation. And yeah, her language is around pacification. So on the 7th of January 2024, she posted this image, well, Fratelli d'Italia posted this image on social media. You can see this, calls for memory of the Acca Larenzia dead. And the text says 3 young patriots, victims of ideological hatred, who are still waiting for justice. On the surface, it feels kind of not that controversial. The facts are true, there is no justice, and they were 3 victims. Kind of sits within this kind of quite moderate facade that the party presents. But I think if you look behind the image, behind the text, at the actual image, we see something really quite different. You see the faint outline of the MSI headquarters, which has become this shrine of neo-fascism today, this kind of meeting point, the stage upon which fascist pageantry, fascist ritual is performed. We can read this, I think, as some sort of validation of those young people belonging to the Fratelli d'Italia youth group, but also to more extreme groups like Casa Pound, who gather here and perform fascist heritage very explicitly in public space. She could perhaps have incorporated, for example, just photos of the young men who were died, but I think the fact that she chooses to do this tells us something different. And I'll finish up just with the response of Ellie Schlein from the Partito Democratico, who responded saying that this is a kind of outrage and a vergogna, shame in the anti-fascist republic. And although we're in 2024, it looks like we're living through 1924 all over again. I'll finish up there and hand over to John.
Thank you, Amy. I think that's great. I'm going to take you back in time to talk about some of the origins of fascism in Italy and the way I've looked at it in my book, above all in my book, The Blood and Power, The Rise and Fall of Italian Fascism, that came out on the 100th anniversary, more or less, of the March on Rome, which is when Italian fascism took power in Italy, and has come out in a new edition in 2023, has also come out in Italian. The main way that there are hundreds of books about Italian fascism, thousands of articles. What I tried to do that was perhaps different was in that book, I try and take the stories of individual people and look at how their lives were affected by fascism, by violence, by the regime, by the movement. And they might be victims, they might be fascists, they might be onlookers. So I kind of tell these stories which are often become odysseys in some way, because the violence that fascism was built on right from the start changed people's lives. And that's often forgotten in the way these stories are told. The violence is often reduced to statistics, or someone was killed, or the experience of violence is something that is not often talked about. And the effect it had on people's, not just their own lives, but on their families' lives and on their economic lives and on their outlook. And in fact, many people were forced into exile. Many people were forced out of their jobs, forced out of their towns, and many people died. And there's still a myth, quite strangely in many ways, that Italian fascism was somehow benign and didn't really kill anybody and was kind of nice, or was a bit of a farce. It wasn't serious. It wasn't like real fascism, which was the Nazis. And I very much don't agree with that. And I was trying to kind of show that very much you can't separate organized mass violence from Italian fascism. It's what made that movement successful. It's kind of the contribution of Italian fascism to global fascism, in fact, almost to the 20th century. And this is the first fascist movement, the first fascist government. So I'm just going to show you, talk about one example that I've spoken about a bit in my book, but also in subsequent work, and I've gone more into detail. And I'm going to take you back to the end of October 1922 in Rome. And I want you to have a look at this photo. This is a very famous series of photos taken by a celebrated and one of the first photo reporters to work in Italy, a man called Alfredo Porri Pastorell, who was an extraordinary photographer and had an extraordinary life, did lots of different things. You can actually find the whole series on the Istituto Luce website, which is an archive website. You can look at them. He took a series of photos of the March on Rome. The March on Rome is often depicted by many historians as a kind of joke, as a kind of farce, as a kind of light opera kind of moment. It's often even depicted a bit like that in the new series M, which is on Sky. It's almost as a bit of a comic moment. But in recent years, historians have really begun to overturn that approach, which was dominant amongst historians for a long time. They've begun to unpack the violence and the serious insurrectional project behind the March on Rome, which was a project for an insurrection of the black shirts, the squadristi, the fascist violent groups, of which you can see quite a lot here, to take local power, and then to march on Rome and take central power. A very successful project, because in many ways that's what happened, although it's not exactly what happened, but it's kind of what happened in 1922. So have a look at this photo, and I want you to think about the man in the middle there with the card around his neck, and try and think about what's going on with him. This man is often misidentified when this photo is used, quite a well-known photo. This man is sometimes, or often and even on the Istituto Luce site, was identified as a man called Francesco Misiano, who was a pacifist, anti-war campaigner, a communist, often attacked by the fascists in this period for his anti-war activity, a hate figure for fascism, eventually driven out of Italy altogether, ended up as working with Eisenstein, making films in Russia, an incredible life. But it isn't Francesco Misiano. In fact, in the first edition of my book, I also thought it was Francesco Misiano. It's actually a man called Giuseppe Lemmi. Giuseppe Lemmi was a communist journalist, quite well known in Rome, but not a major figure, but not a minor figure. And he'd made the mistake of going out for a walk, probably going to work on the 30th of October 1922. He'd been recognised. There are hordes of black shirts who have already reached Rome. They are killing people, burning down buildings, ransacking printing presses, attacking private habitations, beating up people and killing people at random. Probably 50 people were killed in Rome, and they haven't become part of national memory, unlike in many other martyrs, for example, some of the ones that Amy spoke about. Lemmi was captured. He was kidnapped off the street. He was taken to the Fascist Party headquarters. His hair was shaved off. His beard was shaved off. He normally had a beard and hair. You can see that his hair has not been entirely shaved off. He was forced, in some accounts, to drink a litre of castor oil, and then he was marched around the streets. This was something that happened to many people in this period. Fascist violence was not wild. It was not out of control. It was not random. It was targeted violence. It targeted individuals, it targeted buildings, it targeted particular geographical areas. Lemmi is an example for everyone. The fact that they are pillorying him, messo alla bellina, they say, is the phrase in Italian. He's being pilloried like in a kind of ancient ritual of kind of humiliation, is a warning to everyone else. This could be you. Next, okay, you better not rebel, you better not resist, because you're going to end up like Lemmi. And Lemmi didn't know what was going to happen to him. He could have been killed, he could have been tortured. We don't know exactly what happens to him, but he is released eventually by the crowds, by the fascists. He's then forced out of Rome. I found the archival material, and he was forced out of Rome, forced out of his job, forced to go to Venice. He couldn't operate in any political way anymore. And he lived out the rest of his life in Venice, being followed everywhere by secret police who reported on him constantly from the moment of 1922 until his death in the 1930s. So he's just one victim of the March on Rome and of fascist violence. Fascist violence was organised, it was targeted. That's another of the series of photos, extremely dignified response to a terrifying situation. And they put 3 different signs around his neck, some of which said that he was a traitor and hadn't, was against the war. This one says Lemmy, Segretario del Porco Bombacci. Lemmy worked for another communist called Bombacci, and they're saying he's secretary of the pig, Bombacci, who was even more of a hate figure. Bombacci, luckily for him, was out of town during the March on Rome, but his house was attacked. His books were thrown out the window. They made a bonfire of his stuff. If he'd been at home, he could have been there as well. So in my book, I talk about the experience of these victims. I try and unpack it. I try and get deep into the kind of emotional impact and the power of this violence, because the way it worked was to scare, and it's almost like the Maoist slogan, strike 1 to educate 100. Fascist violence was public. It had to be seen, and therefore it worked to scare many other thousands of people out of politics, out of trade unions, out of any kind of resistance. It started off with the far left, and then it moved on eventually to the liberals and the Catholics, and to anyone who was a Democrat in the 1920s. This picture was also used in films and in other cultural products. For example, in the credit sequence of a film called The March on Rome, made in 1962 by Dino Risi. So, to summarize, and there's lots of other things in my book, but the book in the first part is very interested and concentrates on the importance of this new contribution, if you want to call it that, to politics, which is Italian fascism, which is organized, targeted, illegal militia who go around the country. They should be arrested, obviously, but they aren't, and that's another question we could ask ourselves, why not? Like the people who make the fascist salutes in Aquila Laurentius, in theory, should be arrested, but are not arrested, although I think some of them were eventually denounced. But, in theory, they are breaking the law, but they're allowed to do what they want. The squadristi were very rarely arrested, despite clearly being an illegal militia was against a number of laws, not just one. And in the years in particular of 1921, 1922, these organized armed illegal militia managed to destroy not just the institutions of the left, not just the institutions of the union movement, but also democracy itself. And in that series M, which is a very interesting thing to talk about, we could talk about that a bit later, which I would recommend looking at and actually reading the book by Antonio Scarlatti as well, which it's based on. There's a quote from Mussolini. Much of it is in Mussolini's own words, which is a very powerful way to understand the way that he used violence and violent language. He says, democracy is beautiful. It even allows you the possibility of destroying it. And I think that's quite an interesting message for the world we're living in today as well. I'll stop there for now. So thank you.
Oops. I keep dropping things. Thank you so much, Amy and John. This was very thought-provoking, and I think I have 10,000 questions. But I think we can start. I mean, obviously, Amy's talk was really focused on memory and memory culture. And John did mention this quite popular series, M, which, as he mentioned, is based on the book by Antonio Scarlatti. And so I think this takes us to a key question, which has to do with the legacy of Mussolini in Italy today. And I think there are many different things to say, but maybe we can try and focus on a few elements from both your perspectives.
Maybe we'll talk about Predapio. John's, the photo that you showed, can you hear us?
Sorry, I think we need to...
Put it on.
Ah, okay, yeah, sure.
Is that?
make a sound. No?
Maybe we have to hold it really close. Is that better? Okay. The photo that you showed, the close-up of Lemmy surrounded by the squadristi, I'm struck by they're all smiling. It's a kind of stage, say cheese moment, isn't it? Which is kind of extraordinary. And it reminded me as a kind of segue into Predappio. So Predappio is Mussolini's hometown. And it's an interesting space architecturally, isn't it? Because it's it was sort of reconstructed under fascism to have these great monumental fascist buildings, and was basically a space of pilgrimage for people to come and see and appreciate the architecture that the regime was kind of building, this sort of like celebratory space. But if you go there now, it's actually one of the most shocking places I think I've visited, because it's got fascist merchandise shops along the main street, which sell like Mussolini ashtrays and but you can buy replica Manganelli weapons, and kind of extraordinary experience. But I went there on the anniversary of the March on Rome to observe the kind of neo-fascist behavior. And it was, again, a very similar thing. There's lots of kind of smiling for the camera. There's this real spectacle of joy in a setting that's actually very taboo. It really reminded me, that photo, of what I saw, 100 years later or whatever on the anniversary. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, Predappio is such a weird place to go to, and it's really the flashpoint for a lot of the questions of memory, questions of taboo, questions of fascism today, isn't it? It kind of sums up a lot of these things. 3 times a year, there's an organized gathering, right? But people go there all the time. I was there to visit in a day that wasn't an organized gathering, but there were a lot of people who were clearly dressed in black, had tattoos, the kind of fascist look, were there as a day out. Yeah. And what do you see there? You see the shops, you see Mussolini's birthplace, you see his tomb. There's quite a lot of things to see, really, if you're into Mussolini. I suppose that the existence of such a place is really something we need to think about in terms of Italy's relationship with Mussolini and with fascism, and what it means that a place such exists. In Spain, there's the Valley of the Fallen, which is much bigger and grander, but they have managed to remove Franco's body from that and kind of de-Francoized it to some extent. But it's the opposite thing in Italy. The body's been put there in 1957 and has then become a shrine and has reinvented Predappio, which was less important up to then. I mean, the question, I'll put a question to you. What do you think should happen in Predappio? Because there's been a massive debate over this ever since 1945. What do you do with this place? What do you do with it? Let's talk about that debate, maybe.
It's a bit of a whopper of a question. Thanks, John. The thing that was most chilling to me when I went there, is this one on? Yeah. Is that, it starts off in the main street and there's this kind of celebratory atmosphere, shops at kind of Caffè Corretti and all of this kind of enjoyment. And then they march down Via Matteotti, which just feels sacrilegious to see this there, to Mussolini's tomb, queue up. And the friend that I was with who works on fascist memory culture, we were waiting behind a family. They had a small child, she must have been about 8, and they were kind of teaching their version of Italian history, about the greatness, Mussolini, great statesman, etc., to this kid. And then you go into the crypt and kind of underground, and actually it was only at that moment, once we were in it, we realized that there's a queue to do a fascist salute in front of his body and to sign this kind of visitor's book almost, where people write things like, Mussolini, you've never died, you guide us every day, that kind of stuff. My friend and I managed to convince everyone there that we were kind of fascist feminists, if such a thing exists, or maybe in power actually, but I kind of dart off to the left where the women in the family are buried and avoid having to do this terrible thing. Oh, look, let's go over here and look at that. But I think that the place, like the leaving the body there, is really problematic, and that would be my first step. Remove that. I'm not sure where I put it, but yeah.
there's been a long, there was a project, so there's been the debate really hotted up in recent years with the return of, with neo-fascists back in power. Just when Amy was talking, I was thinking about, there's a big debate in Germany about the firewall. Okay, you can't govern with the AfD. That's the firewall. You don't govern with the far right. That firewall in Italy went down in 1994. So this is not a new thing. Berlusconi went into government with the ex-MSI, who had just been the MSI. Yeah. So that's 30 years since the firewall came down. So a lot of this is to do with that. It's to do with legitimation, with being governed by people who come from that tradition, it becoming normalized. And it's in many ways not shocking to many people in Italy. The debate in Bradapia really hotted up when a mayor tried to do something in that town. He was horrified by all this kind of fascist tourism, by these shops. He tried to close down the shops loads of times, but he couldn't do it. And he had this idea of a museum of fascism in the old house of Casa del Fascio, which is an enormous empty building, which is protected by, listed. It's kind of beautiful, but it's there empty. No one knows what to do with it. He had an idea for a museum of fascism, and this led to a massive debate with opposition to him from the left and from the right. It never happened. I thought it was would have been a really interesting idea, that all those people who came to see Mussolini's tomb also get to see some actual information about fascism. But it never happened. He lost the election, and now Pradapia is stuck in this kind of circle, which actually serves a lot of locals because it brings money into the town. This circle of being this place which is kind of very problematic, but no one knows what to do about it.
I wonder, do you think it will ever be, I mean, people are doing the fascist salute en masse during the Mussolini commemoration ceremonies, and I spoke to, there was some police kind of around the edge of the piazza in front of the crypt, in front of the graveyard, and I asked the police, like, why is this allowed to happen? I mean, there was a guy dressed up as Adolf Hitler in full costume, just kind of extraordinary spectacle of it all, and he was a little reluctant to talk, but did just say words to the effect of, it's more trouble than it's worth, and it will create such chaos and kind of, there'll be such an uproar in response to any sort of prosecution that it's actually not worth it. And I think that there's a real fear around, the far right thrive on the idea of being persecuted in the anti-fascist republic. And so you end up in this tricky situation where you don't want to kind of feed that narrative, well, it seems that the state doesn't want to feed that narrative, and so nothing happens. And actually at the recent Accalarencia commemoration, the only person who was stopped by the police, not arrested, but kind of, stopped and asked for their documents, was the anti-fascist who said, "Viva la resistenza," out loud and shouted back in the face of these neo-fascists. And he was the one that got stopped. Do you think they'll ever prosecute?
No, I think it's often in Italy seen it, there's this word nostalgici, which is used, not called fascists, the people aren't called fascists, or nostalgics people, and it's kind of like a joke. They're kind of like seen as ridiculous with their fezzes, and they're, a bit like people in fancy dress or Halloween or something like that. And I think that's a very widespread feeling that this is not dangerous. This is, and in some ways, Pradapia is less dangerous than Accalarencia, right? In my, Pradapia perhaps is a kind of pageant feel to it, possibly, than, I don't know, we could have that debate.
We haven't even talked about the museum that is there.
Yeah, but I think the question we're not dealing with is the question of anti-fascism and the question of generations. We're now in a generation where very few people have actually experienced fascism, where nobody in Parliament is from that generation. For years, many of the parliamentarians had been in the resistance. Many of the Italian presidents had been part of the resistance. So we're in a post-anti-fascist generation. So as much as this is something we can be shocked by, perhaps the shocking thing is that anti-fascism is so weak. And that's something that we could perhaps talk about as well.
I think when I compare the experience of watching these types of neo-fascist ceremonies and the kind of level of participation, I went to Rome in June last year, and it was the 100-year anniversary of the assassination of Matteotti, the kind of great anti-fascist martyr, hero, prominent murder by the fascist regime 100 years ago. And, it was all over the news. There was a constant talk about Matteotti, 100 academic conferences, etc. And I went to the commemoration, the official one, at the spot where he was kidnapped, and there were maybe 40 people there, most of whom had to be there for their kind of role in the local government or whatever. They were sort of state representatives. I was there and people were kind of looking at me like, what, who are you? This is a bit peculiar. Very little uptake from kind of people who didn't have to be there, basically. And it really shocked me, actually, and kind of drove home that point, like, where is the anti-fascist memory culture that could sort of push back against the kind of stuff that we're seeing getting bigger every year?
And Italy is covered in monuments to the resistance, which kind of have no connection with everyday life or are even invisible in some ways. And it's really interesting that these monuments, these fascist-era monuments, or the neo-fascist sites of memory, are the ones which in some ways have more activity around them than the ones that were an official part of the Republic, which were the anti-fascist sites, where the memory activity is very tired and repetitive and hasn't renewed itself in any way. I'm not attacking the people who take part in those things, but there's almost like that's the failure that we have to kind of analyse, as much as being shot by those people marching Pradapia, which is shocking, but it is also, maybe it's not necessarily the only problem.
And in fact, on that note, I think they're creating even more spaces, because that former MSI base that I showed you where they were doing those fascist salutes, just a couple of weeks ago it came out in the news that an association which has a number of Brothers of Italy representatives on the board made a donation to a neo-fascist group in Rome to allow them to buy that headquarters where they gather and do that salute. So they're actually creating more spaces of memory, while the anti-fascist ones are kind of, ebbing.
And I think that just perhaps we should finish this section, but I don't think Meloni is going to institute a fascist Italy. It's a very different time. She has always operated within democracy. She does want reforms that will make Italy much more hierarchical, much more centralized. But I think the real danger is exactly the things that in the way she's running Italy is exactly these areas that Amy's talking about. I mean, it took her a year to mention the word anti-fascist, to actually to leave her mouth. And she only did it once, I think, with the Matteotti. She finally said the word anti-fascist.
She didn't say Mussolini, she said fascist bugs.
Yeah. But she uses this language which is very vague and very clever around the way that she commemorates things, which Amy was talking about. And I think that memory politics is very powerful, and it's very dangerous for Italy's understanding of its past, especially in a moment of transition of generations, where the taboo about the far right is definitely not there.
Shall we talk about Sperati?
You have time, yeah.
Yeah. I was just thinking, John mentioned that there's this new TV show called Son of the Century, which is based on a documentary novel by the historian and writer Antonio Sperati that came out in Italian. And Sperati's documentary novel is apparently based on historical records. He says that all of the words spoken in the novel, all of the scenarios that he kind of paints, are based on newspaper reports, letters, etc. And it speaks from Mussolini's perspective for a lot of it about the rise of Italian fascism, and kind of brings that to life. And Sky bought the rights and turned it into a new TV series that just came out in the UK a couple of weeks ago, that's been out in Italy for a bit, with some big Italian stars in it. next music by the Chemical Brothers, the one with the Chemical Brothers. And I wonder whether you think maybe that kind of the TV series will be the start of like transmitting these stories to another generation and kind of telling that story in a way that they might be kind of more willing to engage with.
It's interesting that book, as I said, there have been thousands of books written on Italian fascism. That book was such a huge success, and I think that was interesting. The interest in the story of Mussolini, but also the way that was communicated through the writing of Scorati, as opposed to all the books written by historians that perhaps weren't read by anybody, or not many people. I thought that was very interesting, and it's opened up a debate around how we communicate that past, but also its successes that past. And the TV series I found very powerful in transmitting some of the aspects of that past to a modern audience. And I think a lot of historians kind of close themselves in, like Ricci, what's the word in English? Like hedgehogs. They say, oh, that thing's too popular. We better run away from that 100 miles an hour. And actually, I think it's really interesting to see why it's popular. What's the use of language both in the visual language and in the written language of Scorati, and why is that working to a mass audience? The TV programs have much more debate about it in Italy than it has here. It hasn't really opened up a debate here at all, as far as I can see. There's been a lot of debate. Mussolini's great-granddaughter was very upset about it and said it was insulting to her great-grandfather, but then it turned out she hadn't seen it. So, her opinion about the program was rather problematic at that point, because she made this big public statement about saying he was a great father and he was always hanging out with his kids, and then she said, and then someone asked her if she'd seen the program. She said, "Oh no, I haven't seen it yet." So she didn't know what she was criticising, but it has opened up a debate, and I think that's really interesting as well. And the presence of Mussolini still in public life is really interesting.
Okay, so before I open the floor to question, you mentioned the word anti-fascist a few times. That's a word that hasn't disappeared from Italian debates. In fact, if anything, sometimes I have the feeling it's been quite trivialized. A couple of weeks ago, Italy basically stopped for the National Italian Song Contest. You really cannot grasp what that is if you're not Italian or you don't have very passionate Italian friends. And daily press conferences are held to talk about what is going to happen on the night, because the contest lasts almost 1 week. And one of the questions that were asked to the host of the festival, which is broadcast via the national channel RAI, and it is a matter of fact that the RAI suffers from significant political influences. So the host was asked whether he could declare himself as anti-fascist, and he sort of like answered, yes, sure, but this doesn't really matter. It does matter to many people, and I was wondering if you could briefly talk about what it means to be an anti-fascist, and what it means to teach and talk about Italian fascism as an anti-fascist.
So this is something I'm thinking about much more intentionally, I suppose, recently, how you teach in an explicitly anti-fascist way. I'm not sure I know the answer, but the way that I approach it in my teaching at Bristol is that I have a module that is explicitly structured around a then and now comparison. So we take a theme relating to historic fascism, like masculinity, reproductive rights, propaganda, etc., and we look at how that theme related, how the kind of theme was addressed under historic fascism, and then we have an hour a week where we look at that theme in the contemporary neo-fascist context. And it's extremely shocking to see actually how little has changed in terms of neo-fascist dynamics, propaganda strategies, etc., between then and now, but also how much the internet has made what was a kind of specifically national propaganda strategy or narrative or whatever, totally international, because the internet has kind of cut off fascism from its national roots and made it just turbocharged it around the world. And so many of the strategies that originated in the Italian context are now being used online by whoever all around the world, and kind of the internet is creating this frighteningly powerful international network of people who can tap into what was originally situated within the national context. So yeah, that's how I'm kind of approaching it, is by actually structuring that into my teaching from the outset.
It's something I could learn a lot from your course, I think. But I teach a course on Italian fascism. I don't hide my sympathies. I try and talk about these real stories to bring home to the students, and I try and get them to study these stories. I think, as I said in my first part of what I said, one of the frustrating things about historiography on Italian fascism and the stereotypes around Italian fascism and Italy in general is always this idea that it wasn't serious, that it wasn't real, that it was a bit of a joke, and you're still fighting against those things. And I think that's the way I try and bring in those issues. But you do get students who are clearly not anti-fascist or haven't thought about it, or are very fascinated by Mussolini. And I think that's a whole another can of worms about how you talk to them and how you think about that kind of approach, who are doing the course because of that as well, maybe. So that's something that I'd like, I need sort of to think about further. I go back to 94 though. I was in Milan in 94. I was in Italy. And I think that is becoming more and more an important moment the more we go on in Italian history. That moment when that firewall came down, and we didn't call it that. And there was a huge demonstration in Milan on 25th of April, massive. And when Meloni won the election, there wasn't a demonstration at all. There was nobody. I don't think there was a single demonstration. Things have changed a lot in those 30 years. And I think that's something, with hindsight, that at the time we didn't think was so important. But that Berlusconi early moment there's the thing called the Overton window, where you make something legitimate. And you can see that in politics today. Something becomes normalized that was absolutely beyond the pale, like doing a certain kind of salute or whatever. That was 94 did that, I think.
Thank you, John and Amy. I think we have quite a lot of time for questions, so I'll grab the mic. I can if you want. I don't know if that's convenient for you. Okay. I assume it works. I can't hear much sound, but yeah, let's try.
I'm wondering if you have had the opportunity to compare this, what you call culture of fascism and neo-fascism or whatever, with communism, because I have taken a couple of Marxism courses, and I find it extremely similar, very, very similar, except of course for the number of deaths, because then the Communist Party has a world record.
Yeah, so some of my work is on left-wing commemorative culture too, and there are similarities in terms of kind of descriptions of the dead as martyrs, for example. That's pretty consistent across the spectrum, as it were. But I think what I really see the differences being is that when neo-fascists commemorate, they are celebrating violence because they are saying that if you die a good fascist death, which is some kind of heroic violent moment, then you are eternally alive. And I don't really see that happening in communist memory culture or left-wing memory culture in quite the same way. I think that what memory culture allows these groups to do is to explicitly revere and celebrate violence as a political method, a political instrument, without actually necessarily engaging in that violence themselves. And that seems to be quite specific to neo-fascist memory culture.
So I'm from Chile, and we have the most dogmatic communist party in the world, apart from Russia, and they do commemorate their dead.
Yeah, they do
A lot.
in Italy too, but I think that what they're doing with that commemoration is something slightly nuanced to do with violence. So.
That's a good question. I wouldn't agree that communism and fascism are the same. Diametrically different in terms of the way they see the world.
No, I'm saying this is the structure.
I mean, one is a radical nationalist ideology, the other one is very much not a radical nationalist, it's nationalist in its origins. One is a believes in class struggle, the other one believes that you should never have class struggle. I mean, they're very, very different ideologies. What do you think of the outcomes of the regimes? They're very different, in my opinion, having studied them. And one thing is communism as in Stalin, another thing is something like the Italian Communist Party, which is has a very different history, and it was very much part of the rebirth of democracy in Italy, and I would defend its history as a democratic organisation in post-war Italy. So I think it's a complicated question, but I wouldn't agree at all that they're similar ideologies. They might have similar outcomes when they're in power, in terms of numbers of deaths. But numbers of deaths doesn't tell you about ideology. It tells you about numbers of death. So, I mean, it's a big debate. Maybe not for here, I don't know.
Yes.
Thanks, Amy and John. That was wonderful. I've got so many questions, but I'll stick with one. I think you're absolutely right about 1994. It had been this kind of watershed moment of the fall of the firewall. But 2022 is also significant, right? And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the campaign, especially Fratelli d'Italia, but also the Lega to a certain extent, and the kind of dog whistles that were used during the campaign. Because I think you talk about it a little bit at the start of your book, Amy. Some of the No, but like the kind of the very loud dog whistles that are used, like in the campaign. But also, it seemed to me like the Democratic Party, the Partito Democratico, their main strategy was to call them fascists, which did not work.
Did not work, and actually builds that idea of persecution, like that I was talking about before. Freedom of speech isn't for everyone, is the kind of narrative that they put forward. The dog whistles during the campaign, what we could be here for hours, wouldn't we, on that one? I mean, Maloney's slogans, some of them, what was the God, family, what's that one? And it's, I was listening to something about it this week. God, family and patria, what do we say? Fatherland. Which is something that Mussolini himself campaigned on, right? This is a kind of fascist era slogan. But I think what's smart about their strategy, and perhaps frightening, is that actually that slogan itself had a pre-fascism history with unification. And so what she does really well is this kind of ambivalence. And when people say, that's a fascist slogan, she says, what are you talking about? This is ignorant, this is woke culture, first to leap down our throats and say we're fascists. It's a Risorgimento era, it's a nationalist slogan. And she's doing that very intentionally, right? You hear what you want to hear. So neo-fascist supporters hear that as a Mussolini cry and a dog whistle, and yet she has that kind of shield against that accusation. So, yeah. Did you want to come in on that?
I think Amy says it all, and you know already, George. I think one of the things that was interesting about the campaign was that Freudian slip, Maloney never wanted to talk about fascism explicitly. She avoided it. She made one tiny little mention of it in a film in English that only went to the foreign press, but she just does not want to talk about it. And that's a canny strategy, I think. It's what good is it going to do her? Because already her supporters know these words and know what they mean, and she has all those nods to her own past, but she's able to move beyond that as well. So I think she's a very, very interesting combination of, and I'm talking to the converted with you, George, of populism, radical nationalism, and opportunism at the same time. And I think it's a very interesting set of things. And to just call it fascist is missing the point, but also completely pointless. And it also is drawing on an anti-fascism that's not there. And I think that, as I said before, it's kind of, you're trying to mobilize something that in that form does not exist anymore, apart from in very, very selected parts of Italy, and people are going to vote for you anyway. So I think, yes, she's a very difficult person to campaign against, and it's a complicated set of things that you need to do, and I don't have the answer, but I think what they didn't work at all, clearly, and probably won't work next time either. Yeah, and there's an uplifting message for you.
Yeah, apparently only this microphone works for the people online. Any other questions?
My understanding of Mussolini was that he wished to have recognition on the world stage. I'm just wondering if the current fascists believe that this is a route to more recognition internationally.
I think there's no problem with that. And that's another firewall that's gone down as well, is the international one. There was no even contemplation of not talking to Meloni or not inviting her or having some sort of even issue with her past. Whereas I think 20, 25 years ago, it would have been different. So they clearly have recognition on the world stage as centre of Europe. And that's another canny game that Meloni has played, is that she hasn't made any noises about leaving Europe, and has played all the right, quite a moderate game actually, in many ways. She's interested in power, not particularly in making Italy different, I don't think, very much. And in that way, she's a bit like Berlusconi. Berlusconi didn't really want to make Italy very different. He was interested in power. I'm sure that I don't think that's the case for Trump, in the sense of wanting to change somewhere, but that's a whole other debate. Mussolini did gain massive international recognition, and it's well known that he was often praised by Churchill and many other leaders in the early years right until the 1930s, sometimes right until the Second World War. So he was not an unpopular leader in the rest of the world.
Yeah, we were just looking at the front cover of Time magazine that had him right on it during the fascist regime, which was shocking. But I think Meloni does, very well in Europe, doesn't she? Like, she, as an individual, she speaks, what does she speak? Italian, English, French, Spanish, and is able to kind of position herself very adeptly in that European context, as, sort of pushing back against this idea that neo-fascist groups, or the far right, not that she would call herself neo-fascist, but are kind of inward-looking, explicitly nationalist. She kind of presents as a person outwardly and kind of engages very explicitly with European politics. You've said the Trump word now, and I fear we're in for it, so I'll hand it back.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Thank you. What parallels would you see between the rise of fascism in Italy and what is happening in the United States at the moment?
I mean, it's very difficult not to see parallels, especially if you've studied the 1920s. More than with Italy today, I see more parallels in America. So January the 6th, I mean, I was sitting in front of my telly like many other people, and I was thinking, March on Rome, like bang in my head. Okay, it's not exactly the same. Nothing's ever exactly the same. What's the quote? Second time as fast, or whatever it is. But there were lots of parallels with that attempt, you know, more successful in way in the Italian, and then really so many parallels with the amnesty, because one of the things that's not really known very much and not studied very much is the first thing that Mussolini did, day one, let's use that phrase, okay, executive order, decree, was to pardon every single squadristi, black shirt, who had committed violence in a law, an amnesty of 1922. It's almost the first act of the fascist government, and it's written into the law that these specific people had committed violence because they were patriots, and therefore and a lot of trials came to an end, and you know, it's hard not to draw parallels with that kind of thing, the use of the law to punish your enemies, etc., etc. So it's never the same. It's never the same thing. The word fascism is not necessarily useful, but I see parallels all the time, and those are only two examples. There are lots of others.
God, it's so bleak, isn't it? The other, I think, really striking parallel that we're seeing now is the way that Mussolini, pre-March on Rome, but also afterwards, managed to stir up violence among the black shirts as they were scattered all around the country and position himself as the person who had the power to bring them under control. And I think Trump is stirring up so much discontent and some kind of pockets of violence, and is managing to say, you know, I can bring them under control, you kind of need me in power in order to prevent further acts of violence. I think there's similar rhetoric there. We might also think about the parallels with the assassination attempts, which my kind of eyes were on stalks when the assassination attempt happened against Trump, because, was it what, 1927, 26? Can't remember the 26. There was an assassination attempt against Mussolini by a Irish woman, Violet Gibson, so, yeah, and she shot him during a rally, and he didn't have his ear grazed, he had his nose grazed, and then went around with a large plaster and talked about the intervention of God in kind of saving him as the leader and the savior of the nation. And I just could not. I thought, am I going mad watching this? Kind of shocking parallels.
Well, there were a number of priests also said at that time that Mussolini had been saved by God from being assassinated, and he went, yeah. There's one other very strong parallel in my mind, and I feel like sometimes you can slip into rhetoric very quickly talking about these things, but it's the role of the mainstream. One of the big historical mistakes of Italian liberalism and of parts of the Catholic Church was to think, let's let Mussolini do the dirty work and we can control him. This is very well done in M, actually, the series. We can control this, it's not going to last. We'll just let them get on with it for a bit, and then we'll really take back power. Of course, what happens is in 24, 25, 26, the fascists turn on the liberals, turn on the Catholics, turn on the democratic Catholics, kill priests, kill Giovanni Amendola, who was a very moderate liberal who'd voted through the Mussolini government. He's murdered with nail-embedded batons as he's in a tourist place having a holiday. So that historical mistake I can see a lot in today's world, that historical error of thinking we can control this, we can tolerate it, it's okay, it's all going to be all right, the Constitution will hold. And I think I am slipping into rhetoric now. But I see that, a lot of that, in terms of parallels with the past.
Any other questions? Okay. You raise your hand at the same time.
Hi, thanks so much for this evening. I'm just wondering what you would like to see changing first in Italy to counteract this sort of dangerous development.
Thanks. Is it okay if I collect also the other question?
If fascism thrives on victimhood, what are the potential pitfalls for an anti-fascist movement in confronting it?
We didn't hear the first part. Can you say it again?
I say if fascism thrives on victimhood,
Was the second question, if fascism thrives on victimhoods, what are the risks for yeah. I suppose my answer to both questions relates obviously to memory because I'm a one-trick pony, but I think the neo-fascists are doing really well at kind of legitimizing and normalizing extremely taboo and in fact illegal rituals, iconographies, rhetoric, etc. And I just wish people would wake up like the Partito Democratico Ellie Schlein, who's actually, every time these commemoration ceremonies happen and there are fascist salutes, she raises it in Parliament and she says, you know, we need a law against this, we need to prosecute this, and she's making noise. And I sort of see her as quite a kind of cutting a lonely figure in Parliament in terms of realizing the risk of this. Because it's not just about fascist spectacle and this kind of moment of power that they seem to enjoy. It is a recruitment tactic that is getting young people more and more involved in far-right politics. And I think the far right historically, you know, Meloni is a product of the 1970s MSI youth group. They have an extremely good track record of nurturing kind of the future leaders through these formal youth groups. And until that aspect is addressed, I think there's a problem for kind of decades to come, if that's not too bleak.
I really don't, I struggle with the answer of what is to be done. You know, it's such a depressing story, the Prodapio story, to go back to that, because that attempt to de-fascistize Prodapio, to build a museum possibly that could educate, fell apart. And it didn't just fall apart because of fascist opposition, it fell apart, a lot of it, because of left-wing opposition to it, of the friendly fire, if you like. And so if left-wing people, if left-wing people can't agree what to do, I don't really know where we go. And outrage isn't enough. Outrage that gets you I mean, I agree, Eddie Schlein, it's been great, but it is a bit shouting to the void. And that is, you know, so it sounds a bit bleak, I'm afraid. On the second question, the power of those victimhood celebrations is undeniable, and their continuity through time. And it's exactly what Amy's studying and has studied in her book, which is, I'd like to say, a very brave book to study by someone who is coming from an anti-fascist point of view. Many people would not touch that issue, and I think it is really interesting and really important because it's precisely where Meloni has come from. She has been going on those commemorations for her whole life, since she was 15. That's her cultural background. And if we don't understand that, we don't understand her, and we don't understand how to combat her. So that's why your book is so important. Your work is so important. And for years, people wouldn't study these things because they felt it was bad taste or something like that.
I think we have time for one, maybe two quick questions before we wrap it up. Okay.
So looking at these gentlemen on the board, they fit very much within this idealized image of kind of this fascist masculine idea of the healthy young male. The question is, how does the Fratelli d'Italia of Meloni and also Le Pen, Alice Weasel with the AFD try to synthesize this kind of very masculine conception of the ideal fascist kind of individual, even though not openly fascist, with this presentation of obviously female leaders within the new far-right kind of movements?
Is there anyone else? Okay, and then.
I was interested to see recently that MAGA has become highly ritualized. They have huge crowds. It's like a continuous game show. We now have Black MAGA, and there seem to be a lot of parallels in the symbols and the rituals. If you go to their meetings, they have all this paraphernalia that you can buy, T-shirts, hats, the rest. Can you comment on that and compare it to the past?
The MAGA merchandise question is really interesting, I think, because now we have this intersection between the internet, the far right, and revenue streams that we didn't really have before. And, you know, Twitter now is just a neo-fascist hellhole, but the algorithm, that, you know, as everyone knows, the more scandalous your tweet, the more engagement it gets, and the algorithm actually favors outrageous neo-fascist comments. And whether or not Musk's politics are that way aligned, of course they are, but that's slightly irrelevant. The algorithm is generating him money because of kind of supporting this neo-fascist turn within social media. I'm also really fascinated by this new rise of far-right. I suppose this connects to the question. I didn't see anyone's face who asked that first question about gender. Hello. Far-right influencers on Instagram, TikTok, who are affectionately termed the trad wives, the traditional wives, who are kind of, to my knowledge, predominantly in the US and espouse a very traditional way of life, you know, saying that feminism has corrupted womanhood and made life miserable for women, and we need to retrench back into the home, serve our husbands, etc. And they are selling that lifestyle through products. They have trad wife, you know, you can buy an apron, or you can buy a protein powder created on their farm in Utah. And there's a really interesting kind of thing happening on the internet where they're commercializing far-right ideology and kind of, yeah, both genders. What was I going to say? Gender and, yeah. So the far-right women, the women of the far right, is just such a fascinating thing that I think we're living through. The thing that I'm drawn to at the moment, I've just had the displeasure of reading Meloni's autobiography, and it's amazing how kind of feminist how she tells her own life story in a feminist way without actually ever obviously using the word feminism. So talking about how she's kind of, you know, become this female leader, and it had been a space just led by men, and how she's broken through that mold. She can't say anti-fascism, she can't say feminism. But there's this new work on the concept that I think is fascinating called femo-nationalism, which is when nationalist leaders use feminism as an excuse to promote nationalist policy. So you see things like, you know, Germany is a feminist, socially progressive culture, and Islam is inherently patriarchal, therefore the two are incompatible and we should halt all immigration. And this kind of projection of feminist values as an excuse to put forward nationalist and far-right policy is a really interesting thing that we're seeing with the rise of kind of far-right women.
On the question of branding, and you referred to the photo, I'm thinking back to the work studying Italian fascism. You know, they had slogans, they had uniforms, they had colours, they had marches, they had, you know, they had all this group identity was not just about what they did, it was how they looked, how they spoke. D'Annunzio is the great slogan creator, of course, of Italian fascism. And I think there's a lot of parallels there. You know, the simple slogan, MAGA is such a powerful, incredibly useful, and the colour and the hat. You know, and here we have the fezzes and the black shirts. So I think there's a lot of interesting things. They're not really make the money, perhaps the money-making aspect is different. But when many squadristi became kind of local bosses, mafia bosses, after they took power in 1922. And the question of gender is such an interesting one. I've had a student working for 3 years on, last 3 years on populism and social media. And I think that's such an interesting switch, and you identify that in these leaders, Le Pen, Meloni, and so on. And Meloni very much draws, as Amy said, on both a conservative past, but also a kind of progressive agenda, and combines the two very powerfully. Mother, single mother, poor background, leader, all of these things mixing up. I think in that way she's very modern, but she's also drawing on this kind of Christian tradition, and that makes a potent mix, which perhaps only she could do. A male leader can't do. Salvini has clearly been completely sidelined by her rise and struggles to break through again.
Okay, I'm afraid it's time to wrap it up. So I just wanted to thank again our amazing speakers for such an engaging, thought-provoking discussion. It's also quite late at night, so I'm personally no. So I'm sure you will join me in thanking them with a round of applause.